Okay, thanks again for joining us at Better Picks. Hope everyone is well. Just going to be going through a very quick edit process for a rainforest image today. I have here a rainforest image that I photographed recently, and while the base exposure is exactly what I wanted it to be, there will be some adjustments that I want to make to this image just to bring out the color and overall results to be a little bit better. So we're going to be editing in Adobe Camera Raw today. So if we start off in Bridge, I've selected my file, right click and open in Adobe Camera Raw or open in Camera Raw. You can see the color of this image. While the base exposure, the brightness levels I'm pretty happy with. Looking at the histogram up the top here, all the data's in a fairly good place, but you can see with the color it's a long way off from the color that actually exists in a rainforest scenario. So we're just going to start with temperature. You can see that the current temperature is set to as shot, so this is how it was shot in camera, and it's quite cool at the moment, so it's got a very strong blue tinge to it, so we certainly want to make some adjustments there. However, if you have a look at white balance, you can see that you can also make default changes within Adobe Camera Raw without making manual adjustments yourself. So cloudy, that warms it up a little bit. Shade, that warms it up a little bit more. Tungsten, that makes it very blue. We definitely don't want that one. Fluorescent, not much better. Flash is very similar to daylight. You can see it warms it up a little bit from the original setting, and then custom is whatever we set it to. So if we go back to as shot, I actually like to use the temperature and tint slider bars here to be able to get the color temperature of the image to exactly where I want it. So if I just click and drag on that temperature, what I'm looking at is really the warmth of the image, and I'm looking at the rocks to give a fairly realistic representation of what those rocks actually look like. So that's much better. So that's up to a temperature Kelvin amount of 7050, remembering that daylight is roughly 5600 give or take. Also just want to have a look at tint. At the moment it's +5. Just going to make some adjustments just to see if we can pull. There's a little bit of cyan in there, so I'm just going to make an initial adjustment up to +11. You can see that's again brought those rocks and the trees and the overall color of the image to a more acceptable level. Remembering that any adjustments that you make to any images is your own creative expression. It's important to remember that the adjustments that you make are always around what you want to do with the image, and it may be a realistic representation, it may be an unrealistic representation of the real world. That's the beauty of creativity, and certainly photography as a medium to express that creativity. You can create an image that really looks any way that you want it to look. What I'm going for today is more of a representation of what I saw. So while the camera has done a good job in recording the scene, and as I mentioned earlier, the exposure is fairly close on, what I want to do is try and give the image a little bit of a boost back to what I feel I experienced while I was there. Alright, so color temperature I feel at the moment is okay. I'm just going to drop that exposure because I feel like this is a little bit bright through here. And what we'll do is make selective adjustments a little bit later. So I've just dropped it by 0.4, and I'm also going to just increase the contrast just a little bit, just to give the image a little bit more punch. Highlights I'm going to drop as well because I still feel like those highlights are just a little bit too overwhelming, or overbearing I should say. Shadows I'm just going to increase a little bit as well because I want to get back some of the detail in these shadow areas just on the left and right hand side in these trees. As I mentioned earlier, we will be making selective adjustments just to help with getting some more detail in those shadow areas. So the vibrance I'm going to increase maybe to about roughly +20, and saturation just a little bit as well, maybe around +8. So that's immediately looking much better than what it was when I started. So if we just look at the before and after comparison, you can see immediately that the image color is much stronger. There's better detail and better tonal range. You can see in the highlights, I've retained a little bit more detail in the highlights and a little bit more detail in the shadows. And that intensity of colour is much better, and certainly the colour temperature is much better as well. You can see on the left hand image it was a little bit pale and blue looking, whereas on the right hand side, certainly in the colour of the rocks and the trees and the shrubs that are down by this stream, that they're closer to a more realistic representation of a rainforest, or certainly the rainforest, this rainforest that I was visiting. So we'll just go back to a single view. Excellent. All right, so we've made those adjustments, those initial adjustments on the opening default panel. What I want to do now is really zoom into the detail and apply a little bit of sharpening. Now, there's many different ways of applying sharpening depending on what you're sharpening for, whether you're sharpening for web, whether you're sharpening for print, and depending on the size of the image that you're printing as well will also determine the amount of sharpening that you apply and the method that you apply it. However, I'm just going to apply a little bit of sharpening in Adobe Camera Raw just so that you can see the difference in that effect. Now, the important thing is when you apply that sharpening that you look at the image on a pixel by pixel basis, which means looking at it at least 100% zoom. So if I just zoom into that image, you can see there's lovely detail there already. It really is a beautiful lens that I've used. You can see on the image settings as well that I've shot this image at f8, which I know for this lens is roughly where the lens works at its absolute best. So hence we have a very sharp image. And you can see there's good detail in the corners. It drops off a little bit in the corners, but certainly in the middle part of the image, there's beautiful detail there. If we come across to the detail tab, which you can see just here, I'm going to, as I mentioned, apply just a little bit of sharpening. So I'm just going to increase that ever so slightly. I don't want to over increase it because it can have a negative effect and create a kind of halo effect around details within the image. And I'm also going to apply a little bit of masking because I don't necessarily want sharpening to be applied to all parts of the image. For example, this water down here, you can see it's quite smooth. I don't want to apply sharpening to the water because I want to retain that smoothness. Whereas the edges of the rocks here and the edges of the plants, I certainly do want to apply some sharpening so that those edges appear sharper, which is the whole intent. So pushing down on my Alt key and clicking on the mask, you can see as I slide that along, it starts off at full white, which means the sharpening is applied to all parts of the image. If I slide that along, you can see it's slowly but surely only applying the sharpening to the edges, or what it deems to be edges within the image. And that looks pretty good to me. So I've applied quite a bit of masking there, but you can imagine that in a rainforest there's quite a lot of edges. There's quite a lot of sort of edges and sharp edges to consider. So sharpening is roughly halfway. I can probably back that off a little bit, and the masking is at around 86. So you can see the white edges there, or the white parts of the image where the masking is actually being applied. Excellent. I'm not going to worry about noise reduction for this image. It was actually shot at ISO 50, and looking at the shadow areas, there's really not a lot of noise, so not any issue that we need to worry about. Applying noise reduction can soften the image slightly, so we certainly don't want to apply something that's going to potentially have a negative effect unless we absolutely have to. Moving across to lens correction, the next area that I tend to apply an adjustment to an image. Remove chromatic aberration. This is something as a standard that I do on all images, and it's very simple. It's just clicking that checkbox, and we may be able to find an example of chromatic aberration if we zoom right in and look at some of the edges. You can see very slightly there's a very slight hint of color fringing on these edges, and if I click on that, you'll see it actually disappear. Particularly here, if we look at this section where this rock and this water joins, up here as well, up on the top towards the left hand side. Now, chromatic aberration does happen even with expensive lens. This is a professional grade lens, and you can see that it still does happen. Now, if you're posting photos to the internet, you know, on social media, Facebook, Instagram, that sort of thing, probably not a big issue. But if you do come across an image where, you know, you're really happy with the image and you want to print it to a decent size, then absolutely that chromatic aberration can be quite obvious. Now, as a rule of thumb, generally my approach is always get rid of your chromatic aberration, then you don't have to worry about it. All right, let's go back to the default panel. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I want to make some selective lightening and darkening of this image depending on the exposure values or brightness values that we can see. And the way that I'm going to do that is go to my adjustment brush, which the shortcut is K. Now, what I want to do is just slightly increase the exposure. I'm just going to adjust that to +25. So this does exactly the same as the previous tab of exposure where it brightens the image. However, using an adjustment brush, it means that you can apply that exposure increase to only certain parts of the image. Now you can see with this adjustment brush that there's an inner circle and an outer circle. The inner circle applies that adjustment to at 100% of what we've set it to, and then it slowly feathers out to that outer circle, which you can see it's a dotted line for the outer circle. If we head down to the bottom part of the adjustment brush panel, you can see size and feather. Now, as I decrease the size, you can see that adjustment brush has gotten smaller. If I increase the size, it gets bigger. And the same with the feather. If I decrease feather, the difference between 100%, that inner circle, and the outer circle has been reduced quite a bit. Now, to apply a soft adjustment or a soft, so to increase that feathering amount, I've increased it to 100 so that we're not getting hard edges of adjustment within the image, which is always a good thing. And I'm just going to start to paint. You can see a slight increase in exposure there in those shadow areas. Now, if I keep painting and clicking on the mouse, it won't actually adjust anymore because it only applies once, unless I come over to the right hand side and click New, which the shortcut is N, and then I can apply again. And you can see a little dot will appear, which is a new adjustment brush. All right, so I'm just going to increase that a little bit more. So you just get that detail out in those shadow areas, which looks much, much better. You can get rid of those dots if you like. If you come down and click Overlay, that gets rid of those dots so they're less distracting. You can also have a mask appear, so you can see that that current adjustment brush is selected. If I click on mask, it will show where I've actually applied that adjustment brush. However, it's not something I normally use because I'd prefer to actually see the effect on the image rather than a colored mask. You can change the color of the mask as well just by using a simple eyedropper tool just to make that a little bit more obvious. However, it's not something I normally use because I'd rather see directly on the image the effect that it's having. Just going to come back to our original adjustment panel. I'm just going to drop that exposure just a little bit more contrast, and then I'm going to come back to our adjustment brush and just increase the exposure ever so slightly. This is a technique that I've been using quite a bit lately, where I drop the exposure and then paint it back in, paint in an increase in exposure. And I just find that this just gives me a little bit more control over areas of an image where there are big differences between highlight and shadow. Now, if we go back to that original image, you can see now that we have a really well balanced exposure. The saturation and color intensity is looking really good. We've got great detail in the shadow areas, which was lacking a little bit in the original photograph. And the color is a much more accurate representation of what this forest would look like. Remember, this is my creative approach. Everybody's creative approach is different, which is totally good. That's one of the wonderful things about photography. So this has just been some basic adjustments on a rainforest image, and you can see that the final result is a lot more pleasing than the original result. While the original image was certainly strong in its exposure and composition, this has just helped to bring out more detail in the shadow areas, better color, and more accurate representation of the color itself. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want, and we've got more videos coming.